kind of systemic segregation in our nation, and most people don't know this, and I didn't know it most of my life, that the federal government actually had a role along with the banking industry in beginning even as early as the 30s with some of the federal housing programs and creating areas that were set aside for white people only, basically.
Is this what they used to call redlining?
Redlining, it really became especially known as redlining after a lot of soldiers started coming back from World War II and then later the Korean War, and there were these programs that provided government-backed loans for people to get buy homes, and that was when the suburbs, as we have known them, really got their start. And during that time, the federal government, in order to protect, as it saw it, protect its monetary interests in the loans, saw blacks moving into a neighborhood as bringing down the price of housing. And so it was a threat to their mortgages. And so they collaborated with banks to create areas around neighborhoods with literal red lines.
Yep. And these were loans that returning GIs got through the GI Bill.
A lot of them were, a lot of them.
My recollection also is that, ironically, one of the first cities where this happened was Baltimore, Maryland, which is a majoritarian black town now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and the interesting thing, are sad and the thing we're still fighting is once you have a situation where you have a lot less people like African Americans having the kind of wealth that is often built by individuals in their homes, and African Americans starting out without that sort of base of building wealth that gets passed down from generation to generation. That means that over a period of time, the disparity between the accumulation of wealth and kind of family well-being for African Americans and other people of color as well, it started spreading further and further apart. So to jump ahead into the 60s, in 1964, there had been, as I said, a lot of struggle with people really putting their lives on the line, taking African Americans and supporters of theirs who were white, in some cases, going on buses down to the South where the race lines were extremely rigid and it was explicitly in the laws themselves, and challenging that. And in 1964, after a lot of effort, and Lyndon Johnson was backing this. The first federal civil rights bill was passed in 1964.
It's the Voting Rights Act.
The Voting Rights Act was in 65.
That's right, that came later.
The 64 was around public accommodations mostly.
Sure.
And a few other
it's like the lunch sit-ins and
Yes.
the bus,
being able to use any cafe or restaurant or public accommodation. Yep. But they were trying to get housing, fair housing, or prohibition on discrimination in housing, put it another way, built into those first civil rights laws. But the opposition to that was much, much stronger and more rigid than it was to the other civil rights laws.
Gets people where they live.
Right. So what happened ultimately is in, I think, April 4 of 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated, and the cities that were already tinderboxes went up literally in flames, and there were major riots and all kinds of civil disobedience happening around the country. And within a week, there were enough of the people in Congress that saw the writing on the wall and came around to saying, okay, I think we do need this fair housing part of the law. And so 1 week after Martin Luther King's death, the first Fair Housing Act, the Act 8, I believe, was passed, and since then it's been modified with some other protections added. And I'll just jump forward one a little bit to say that Vermont passed its fair housing law first in 1987, and since its first passage has added some other categories. And what is fair housing? Fair housing is certain people who've been on the losing end of the housing transactions in the past because of certain characteristics, such as their race, their national origin, their religion, whether they, as we get further into our times now, people who have a different sexual orientation, people who have a different sexual identity, and people who receive public assistance have been at a disadvantage in the housing market because of discrimination. And for that reason, fair housing laws say that it's illegal to not give them housing or loans or insurance, anything connected with housing, just because of one of those categories that they're in.